cheating for money. And when I first was in England at boarding school, where I was completely miserable, I felt bad to tell my parents back in Bombay that I was unhappy, because I thought they'd made this great effort on my behalf. They've sent me to school in England, it's very expensive, my mother is sad that I'm not there, etc. How can I say that I'm having an awful time, you know? So I think the first fictions that I wrote were those letters home, you know? Played cricket, scored 23 not out. Took 3 wickets with my slow right arm bowling. All complete bullshit. I was never any good at cricket at all. But they were happy. And so when I when I left school and told them what had really been happening, they were of course absolutely horrified. They said, how can you have done that? Because if we knew you were so unhappy, we'd have taken you out, you know, and we'd have brought you home, etc. That possibility somehow never occurred to me, you know. So anyway, you see, what's interesting to me about the kind of book that you're doing is there's suddenly quite a lot of very good writers trying to do this thing, kind of harvesting stories of ordinary life, people who don't have the ability to tell their own story, you know. I mean, I guess you could say that, you know, in Chicago, Studs Terkel started doing it, you know, a long time ago. But now you have, well, you have, you know, from China, Liao Yiwu, with his wonderful book, The Corpse Walker, and others, where he goes and finds very disenfranchised Chinese lives and tells their story. And even now, this year's Nobel laureate, you know, Svetlana Alexievich, has very much done that. And what is interesting is the way in which the stories are told is very literary. They're not told in a kind of journalistic way. You know, let's say the journalist, well, Alexievich, for example, she removes herself, you know, and she actually tells the story in the first-person voice of the person whose story she's telling. So she gives them voice, which they, for themselves, don't have. So it's become we're an important new literary form, you know. And so if you're doing this for New York, then because one of the things I think you've been interested in New York, as I am, is this wealth of new immigrants, you know, the new kinds of immigrants, not just the traditional immigrants who built the city, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, but now everywhere. So maybe just say a little bit about that.
Right, so 2 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or their children, and we all feel this compulsion for storytelling. So you're right, there's actually, I think, a renaissance in this kind of storytelling, which is also married to the techniques of fiction writing. So I began as a fiction writer. I'm a licensed fiction writer. I have an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. But when I got out of the Iowa Writers Workshop, I realized if you change one letter, it becomes the Iowa Waiters Workshop. So no one was going to pay me to write short stories, so I turned to journalism. But I brought in some of the techniques of the novel, plot, character, motivation, into the journalism. And so as I go around, I've been meeting people in all these different worlds of New York, high and low. Everyone from Raj Rajaratnam, who spent one summer telling me about why he didn't plead guilty and his attraction to astrology, to African asylum seekers and Bangladeshi politicians, and it's the gamut. But it's really a gift when I listen to someone who's telling me their story, and then I can do what I want with it. I can put it in alongside other stories and weave in my own story. So as I listen to their stories, they also expect mine, and I give it back to them.
No, but when we started, we thought of Salman Rushdie as someone who had actually given voice to the people in literature, in the canon of literature, whose voices had not appeared in English before. So I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that, even as he's generously giving.
I can't tell you how many Indian Bhasha writers were pissed off about that. there was this famous review in the New York Times which said that about Midnight Children that it sounded like continent finding its voice, and all these people say, "Excuse me," which I mean I understand what they mean. Of course that's right. But what was so strange about? I remember when Midnight Children came out, and I was in India soon afterwards, and people asked me what other contemporary Indian writers in English I was reading, and I could truthfully say that nobody, and I wasn't trying to be a smart ass, they actually couldn't think of anybody. I could think of writers from earlier generations. I could think, Anita Desai and Raja Rao and Narayan and Niraj Chaudhary and so on. And actually, by the way, I have to tell you, remind me to tell you my Raja Rao story. But I genuinely thought that maybe this book that I'd written was the end of a line. Maybe it was that after independence and so on, that the literatures of the languages of India would simply take over, and that Indian writing in English would just dwindle. I thought maybe that's what's going to happen. And certainly at that moment in 1981, that's what seemed to be happening. And then exactly the opposite happened, and this incredible explosion of writing in English happened, which now I'm happy to say is also in Pakistan, because for a long time it was in India and not really in Pakistan. Now this younger generation, the Pakistani writers are in many ways certainly as interesting as the Indian writers, if not more. So yeah, I felt odd that I was just at this hinge moment, where it felt as if Indian writing in English could go this way or that way, and I wrongly guessed that it would go downhill, whereas instead it went amazingly uphill.
Well, only 10% of India is conversant with English, so that's only 130 million people. It might soon be the world's largest English language publishing market at this rate.
No, I mean, the other thing is, one of the big problems, I think, for the Bhasha writers is that they're trapped in their language. So because even inside India, the quality of translation between Indian languages is often non-existent or not great. Even Tagore, a lot of the translations, including into English, are disappointing. And so if you can be the greatest writer in Kannada, but you're kind of stuck in Kannada. Whereas if you write in English, then what one might loosely call the novel reading class, which is, let's say, people who've had secondary education, that group of Indians all reads in English wherever in India they are. So if you're an Indian writer in English, if you're Arundhati or Kiran or Ketu or whoever, then you can be read all over the country, as opposed to only in your region. And so that's a kind of advantage.
Yes. Their books are sold in pirated versions at traffic stops all across the country, rather than only in the state in which you're.
He's got a good story.
Well, a few years ago I was in a taxi at a traffic stop in Bombay, and these kids who have these books, they run up to you, as anyone who's been to India knows, and he had a stack of books, and on top of it was mine. It says, "Chalo lelo machimum fede, machimum fede."
Did you buy it?
Well, I said, "What's this book about?" He said, "Are sir, isme to pura Bombay hai. All of Bombay is in this book." I said, "That's great. How much is it?" He said, 500 rupees, 500 rupees. I said, I've written this book. ठीक है, अगर आपने लिखी तो आप 400 में ले लीजिए. If you've written it, you can have it for 400. And this is Bombay to me. This is the entrepreneurial energy. I love this kid. I called up my publisher at Penguin and I said, fire your sales staff and hire these kids. Because they bring the bookshop to the reader.
Can I tell my Raja Rao story? This is just to show how Indian literature has changed and how much it's reached out in a way into these new areas. It used to be much more elevated, you know, and not in a good way. And I was at a big Indian literature conference in London many years ago, like 1982 or something. And Raja Rao stood up and spoke for quite a long time. I mean, like 10 minutes in Sanskrit. And we're all sitting there, you know. And at the end of it, he said, every educated Indian will understand what I've just said. So this room full of educated Indians, you know, immediately began to hate him. And then he said this thing, which is, I mean, it's so Monty Python-esque that you can't make it up. He was talking about literature, and he said, let me use the metaphor of water. He said, now water without movement is what? Is a lake. Water with movement is what? Is a river. Water is still the same water, only movement has been added. Then with this wonderful Indian phrase, by the same token, which it's not at all, but by the same token, he said, sound is silence to which movement has been added.
Well, so I'd like to read a writer's prayer, which the great Sadat Hasan Manto wrote, who was maybe the greatest South Asian writer of the 20th century. So Manto came from the north of India to Bombay in the 1930s and wrote Bollywood movies. And then during partition, he left for, or just after partition, he left for Pakistan and stayed in Lahore the rest of his life and became an alcoholic. And he really was a prophet. He saw much of what was going to happen to the subcontinent, particularly Pakistan. He's got a hilarious set of letters to Uncle Sam, which Muhammad Hanif's just written an op-ed about those letters. But this was his version of a writer's prayer. Dear God, compassionate and merciful, Master of the universe, we who are steeped in sin kneel in supplication before your throne and beseech you to recall from this world Sadat Hasan Manto, son of Ghulam Hasan Manto, who was a man of great piety. Take him away, O Lord, for he runs off from fragrance, chasing filth. He hates the bright sun, preferring dark labyrinths. He has nothing but contempt for modesty, but is fascinated by the naked and the shameless. He hates what is sweet, but will give his life to sample what is bitter. He does not so much as look at housewives, but is entranced by the company of whores. He will not go near running waters, but loves to wade through slush. Where others weep, he laughs. Where they laugh, he weeps. Evil blackened faces, he loves to wash with tender care to highlight their features. He never thinks about you, preferring to follow Satan everywhere, the same fallen angel who once disobeyed you. Manto.
You know, I mean, well, like you, I'm a great lover of Manto, and one of the things I would really recommend to people is that you should find these letters to Uncle Sam, which are the most hilarious letters, which, you know, Uncle Sam becomes like Chacha Sam, you know. And what is even more wonderful is that he invents Uncle Sam's wife, who is called Auntie Sam. Auntie Sam is even funnier than Uncle Sam. Anyway, but he's a super great writer. And I think never really got his due in his lifetime, in either India or Pakistan, because he wrote so much about the bottom of the barrel, you know, because he wrote about petty thieves and prostitutes and people scraping a living, and, you know, not grand figures. And yet, for that reason, he becomes the immortal writer. You know, And I probably learned from Manto more than from any other Indian writer, I think, and because he's funny too. And I mean, even when the stories have an incredible blackness, there's always a kind of black comedy in them as well. And he basically drank himself to death, which we are trying not to do.
So you mentioned in passing writers in Bombay. So since we're drawing a little bit closer to the end, do you want to make some comment and statement about that?
Yeah, I would. And also, can I just borrow the book? I wanted to also read a paragraph about New York City after that. But I think it's very. There's been some news today which is optimistic, which is that. As you know, the attacks on writers have not ceased. In fact, only was it yesterday or the day before there was an attack on a Dalit writer because he opposed the caste system. Quite violent attack. And he has rather courageously said that he is not going to be silenced by that attack. But finally, today, the Sahitya Academy has actually spoken up. And so the writers' protest has at least had that effect, that there is actually a very strong statement from the Sahitya Academy. And writers like Vikram Seth and Anita Desai, who were basically waiting to see what the Academy would say today. I think Vikram certainly has said that he thinks it's a very strong statement. And rather sweetly, the Academy has asked the writers if they would please take their awards back, because the Academy does not wish to receive them back. So I mean, that's good, but that's the first step. The point is, of course, the real object of the writers' protest was not the Sahitya Academy. You know, it was the government, and the extraordinary silence of the Prime Minister persists. This is the most talkative Prime Minister in recent years, except on subjects of free expression, when suddenly he has nothing to say, and his accessories, let's call them, say that why should he? He doesn't have to have a point of view about everything. But actually, if citizens of India are being murdered for expressing their thoughts, then the Prime Minister of India does have a responsibility to say something. And not to say it is to tacitly give permission to that kind of behavior. And I think that's what worries so many people about this administration. Anyway, there's I wanted just to end on a nicer note. Find it.
Why don't you tell them the story about the mayor of just because it is an example also.
I remember that story. I wrote it. The episode in my new book that Amita was talking about is, so immigration is good for cities, and all around the world we're seeing this. I think it's going to be the defining issue of the 21st century, how we take in people who are not us. I found an example of how immigration works in the unlovely city of Schenectady, New York. So Schenectady, for several decades, has been this rundown industrial town with old Poles and Germans and Irish who used to have these textile factories. And then people stopped coming, the jobs dried up, and it just became this huge ghost town, a land without people. So the mayor, this was in the 90s, a man named Albert Jurzinski, a good Polish mayor, he was walking around and he had a constituent who was Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, and he heard the man say, you should get some Guyanese people over here. We don't need any public assistance. And the mayor said, you're singing my tune. So the mayor started going to the Richmond Hill Community Center one Saturday every month to pick up Guyanese. And he started telling the people in Richmond Hill, oh, ye Guyanese, come up to Schenectady and we'll give you basically a free house, and you can set up a home and we'll help you set up businesses. We just need you. And this Guyanese had never heard of Schenectady. So he started personally taking them around in a Greyhound bus all around Schenectady, and then taking them to his mother-in-law's house for homemade Polish wine. In spite of the mother-in-law's wine, there are now 10,000 Guyanese in Schenectady. There's a Guyanese cricket league, there's Guyanese city councilmen, and to me this is the possible future.
It was going to cost $16,500 to demolish a house, you have written.
Right.
And the houses were given away for $1.
That's right.
On the condition that they refurbished it.
That's right,
And
exactly.
therefore it was, as they say in America, a win-win situation.
You know? And now there's a new spice in the mix in Schenectady.
That's a great story. Well, I just, just following on from what you want to be the, following on from what Suketu's been saying about this kind of mixture of narratives, all these different streams of story, flowing together in the great city. There's just a little, I guess, Whitman-esque ode to New York, which happens near the end of the novel. So this is set in the future when things are better than they are now. We take pride in saying that we have become reasonable people. We are aware that conflict was for a long time the defining narrative of our species, but we have shown that the narrative can be changed. The differences between us of race, place, tongue, and custom, these differences no longer divide us, they interest and engage us. We are one. And for the most part, we are content with what we have become. We might even say that we are happy. We live here in the great city and sing its praise. Flow on, rivers, as we flow on between you. Mingle, currents of water, as we mingle with human currents from elsewhere and from near at hand. We stand by your waters amid the seagulls and the crowds and are glad. Men and women of our city, your costumes please us, close-fitting, colorless, fine. Great city, your foods, your colors, your speedy sensuality, casual encounters begun, fiercely consummated, discontinued, we accept you all. And meanings jostling in the street, rubbing shoulders with other meanings, the friction birthing new meanings unmeant by the meaners who parented them. And factories, schools, places of entertainment and ill repute, our metropolis, thrive, and we are yours, and so we go together between the rivers, towards an end beyond which there is no beginning, and beyond that none, and the dawn city glistening in the sun.
Now begins that magic time when audience gets to ask questions. So please raise your hands. Please, sir.
Well, first I want to congratulate Salman, your new book, and Suketu, thank you for reading from your unpublished book. Two quick questions. You rightly said, Salman, about the fact that the engagement of the writers with the Sahitya Akademi is not with the Sahitya Akademi, but with the government. The first question is, what potentially can be done by us as writers and poets beyond such, let's say, statements to actually question the government per se in its, let's say, polarization of basic things like meat, basic things like what unites us in the, let's say, diaspora is dividing us back home. And second, perhaps a separate question was, what is your relationship with awards? I was reading recently about Jean-Paul Sartre, the denial of Nobel Prize, and every time a Nobel Prize comes, there's all heartburn in Indian newspapers. It's a racist prize, it's a Western prize, it's a this, that. How do you engage with the, let's say, high honors such as the Nobel and such? Is that something that should writers covet or not?
Well, I think Suketu should get it. No, the best thing ever said about literary awards was said by Kingsley Amis on the night that he won the Booker Prize, late in his life. And he went up to the acceptance speech, make the acceptance speech, and he, you know, Kingsley was known to occasionally have a drink. And so I think by the time he went up to accept the prize, he had probably had a drink. And he stood at the microphone and he said, you know, I have always completely despised this prize, but I've just totally changed my mind. And I think that the truth that that contains is that it's not why you do it, but it's nice. You know, that's you don't know. I don't think anybody who's seriously engaged in the business of writing books loses much sleep over prizes and whether they come your way or they don't come your way. You know, if they do come your way, you say thank you nicely, and you know, being acknowledged for your work and so on. It's gratifying, but it has nothing to do with why you do it. You know, and so yeah, it's nice when you get them, and it doesn't matter when you don't. You know, and usually, I mean, I think, for example, you know, people always complain about the Nobel and how it doesn't go to the obvious people, you know, but sometimes the people it goes to, they perform a great service because they illuminate a brilliant body of work that otherwise a world literature readership might not have been aware of. You know, that certainly, it happened to me when they gave it to the great Polish poet Wisława Szymborska. You know, I'd never heard of Szymborska, you know, until the Nobel, and then read her and discovered that really she's a great writer, you know. So there they did a great service. And I think something the same with Alexievich this year, you know, that this is a really quite extraordinary body of work. And also very enlightened of them to see that the thing that's been happening in literature is that the borders between fiction and non-fiction have been eroding, you know, and that non-fiction can be as creative as fiction in some ways, and as worthy of recognition, you know. So sometimes they really get it right, you know. And so that, I think, is a really valuable function to draw attention to a body of work that otherwise might not have been noticed, you know. Yeah.
Amitabh. Can I?
Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm a great fan of both of you, Suketu and Salman. Unlike you two who write books that are widely read, I write books that nobody reads.
So do we.
I also have a website on which I post whatever I write, and nobody visits that website. Apart from that, whatever you said today, first I have to comment on what Suketu said, then I will come to a very important point Salman touched upon. Suketu, you mentioned that your friend in Jamaica living and showing off. That's exactly opposite of my experience and many of my friends' experience. I've never done well after coming to this country 30 years ago. I've been struggling all through till today. And that back home, the impression is that he's one of those capitalist bourgeois and he deserves to be exploited. In other words, when I go home on vacation, there are lines asking for, as someone rightly mentioned, asking for favors, asking for money. Even before I had a house here, people who were building houses there were asking for money when I was traveling, working and going to school. Anyway, that's not a norm. Anyway, I only want to say that is an exception, I think. An exact opposite of the experience I have and my friends have. Anyway, what Salman mentioned about the Indian literature in vernacular. Kannada you mentioned. Similar, I only wish some great authors in those literatures, those languages, somebody would come forward and translate to English. They will be world famous because the profound wisdom and thoughts contained in some of those books. I personally experienced because I studied in Malayalam first, my language. The Malayalam professor, he was the one who opened my mind towards English literature. I will come to that.
Well, look, the thing is, of course, there need to be more translation.
Yeah.
You're right, but there are there are writers from other Indian languages who have been well translated. I mean, Sukethu was very close to Ananthamurthy, for example, and I think and Ananthamurthy's novel Samskara, has been well translated by Ramanujan into English. And as I say, one of the big problems is Tagore, because many of the particularly the translations of the poetry are really awful. I mean, even Gitanjali, it's not great, but some of the novels, Gore Baire is quite well translated, The Home and the World. So, getting that.
Let me complete my
No,
thought.
sorry, so,
Let me complete my thought. This is something I started only. Let 2 more minutes. There's a great Malayalam thinker and critic. His name was Sukumar Arikod. He died 2 years ago. He was my professor, Malayalam professor. To be honest, he was the first person who introduced me to Bertrand Russell. The name Bertrand Russell, as an undergraduate student under him studying Malayalam, he mentioned it. Afterwards, I got interested in Bertrand Russell and his philosophy and his writings. I got interested. So, if only people in Malayalam also.
Good translate. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm taking too much time.
That's okay. No problem. Please.
Mine will just be the opposite.
questions, things with question marks at the end.
Mr. Rushdie, if Tagore's works are disappointing,
The translation.
The translations I'm talking about.
then how did he win the 1913 Nobel Prize for Literature?
I wasn't there. I don't know, I mean, really, I have no idea. But I think, for example, I'm told that many of the translations of Tagore into Russian are extremely good. And that there's something about Russian which allows Bengali to translate well into it. For example, a lot of his work uses internal rhyme schemes and things like that, and that goes very well into Russian. So it may well be, and I know, for example, he met the great South American publisher Victoria Ocampo, who came to Calcutta to meet him, and she made sure that everything he had written was translated into Spanish and propagated around Latin America. So his reputation, and again, apparently, those translations are very good. I'm only talking here about the translations into English, particularly of the poetry. But he has been widely translated in many languages, and in many cases better translated than in English, allegedly. So maybe that's the answer.
Let me go back to the young man at the back. Yes. Go on.
Hi, so this question is addressed to both of you. So I think it's been some time since you both actively lived in Bombay. And even if we look at the last 10 years, there's been a violent change in the city. It's not so much that the population has increased, the geographical scope of the city has increased, even the name has changed officially. So when you write about Bombay today, are you writing an historical portrait, or how do you rationalize with what the creature is today?
Well, I'm not writing about Bombay today, I'm writing about New York and cities all over the world. And the name, by the way, was changed in 1995, before I went back to live there.
Now it's only known as Maximum City.
Yeah. Well, Minimum City, I understand, is the cover of India Today, which is supposed to be coming out today. I mean, we both go back to the city, and this is the city that it's the city of our childhood. So we have this huge space in our hearts for it. That's why we'll always be Bombay boys wherever we go. But it's changed in good, but mostly bad ways. I mean, it's become a brutal city. It lacks definition, it's got no control over its own politics. It's a city in which too much money is coming in for too few people. And it's often become an ordeal. And with every year it's growing more intolerant. The kind of people that I wrote about in my book, who were still, in the 80s, 90s, they were making their ascendance in the city. They now dominate the politics and the economics and the cultural life of the city. So this is why we're so passionate about the city when we write about it, because it's like seeing a family member getting disfigured, and that's all we can do, write about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly neither of us would accept that we're completely out of touch with what's happened to the city, although of course it has changed. In fact, the last time we were there together, I recall having, I suspect, a drink or two, and talking about all these things with friends of ours who live there and who know a lot about it. Naresh Fernandez, for example, is a good friend of both of ours and is probably the great local historian of Bombay. If you want to know anything about Bombay, including where the bodies are buried, Naresh will tell you. Where have the statues gone of the colonial figures? Which little provincial park are they sitting in, staring at each other? He will take you there. But I agree that the city has darkened. And I think that's I don't know if it's a subject for us, but it's a subject, because it used to be a city that prided itself on its tolerance and openness and its lack of communal trouble. It used to favorably compare itself to Delhi and Calcutta as being the place where nothing happened really in 1947. There were no riots, no murders, and Bombay people always thought that's who we are. We're the people who get on with each other and we don't have any time for that stuff. And then in 1993, really, with the explosions, that changed. And since then, it's become more and more a problem. And it's a sadness, it's a sadness to see a place that you've loved become much less lovable.
I actually was in Bombay briefly with Suketu. We were in Madanpura, and there was a guy at the side of the road selling pornography. One of the books
was Maximum City.
One of the thin books had Bill Clinton on the cover. So I stopped him and I said, "Isko zara padhte hain, boss." I turned over. Bill Clinton was presented on the cover through a keyhole, and he was clutching a woman. And when I turned, it said, the first line was, I'm translating from the Hindi, it said, William Jefferson Clinton was not the first president of America to engage in licentious acts, but he was certainly the most colorful. And from there the story proceeded.
Actually, not even true. The most colorful is John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I mean, the one who engaged in the most licentious acts. So yeah, but more innocent days.
Yes, there was a hand up there, yeah.
Yes, you spoke about, I'm sorry, the question is directed to both of you. You spoke about the darker side, the darker aspects of Bombay. On a more positive note, if you had to pick one quality about Bombay that appeals to you most, and which in your opinion has remained unchanged, what would it be?
Bhel puri. Look, we speak this way because we love the city and we have the right to. After the 2008 attacks, the terrorists that planted those bombs, their aim was to repeat the 92-93 riots. They thought the city would tear itself apart. It did no such thing. The calm held, and I remember the local Muslim imams refused to bury the bodies of the terrorists, saying these were not Muslims, so they could not be buried in Bombay. And the city did us all proud then. It reacted in this way. I mean, the security services failed abysmally. We should have known that these people were coming. There were numerous intelligence alerts, but the city did not tear itself apart. And the very next day after the attacks, the stock market was working, people went back to work, and people carried on without killing each other. So it's got both, It's like India as a whole. Anything that you can say about it is true and false simultaneously.
One of the things about the terrorist attacks recently is that they are connected to the rise of of very powerful gangster culture in Bombay. You know, the enormous power of D Company. You know, and the fact that Dawood Ibrahim, the D in D Company, is almost certainly based in Karachi. That one of the things that we knew was happening between Karachi and Bombay is that there was bribery of Coast Guard officials, which would leave a gap in the Coast Guard so that high-speed motorboats could come through with contraband to be sold in Bombay from Karachi, and that was happening every night. Right? And it seems quite likely that the same gap was used to send the terrorists in boats which might well have been the same boats which were used by D Company to bring all kinds of other things in. So you have a problem which arises out of the criminalization of the city. So that's the dark side. But the other side is exactly what Suketu said, which is that the city reacted to it with great civilization. You know, and that old Bombay actually reasserted itself in that dreadful moment. And I think the city distinguished itself, you know, at that time. And we should, you know, respect that.
The gentleman with the beard.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Rushdie. In your interview to NDTV, you mentioned that you're not a citizen of nations, you love cities, you know, in the sense that you connect yourself with cities much more than countries.
Yeah.
So what sort of an experience is it as a citizen of a city than a nationhood?
Well, one of the characteristics of the great metropolis is that usually the rest of the country kind of dislikes it. You know, Paris is not popular amongst the rest of France. You know, London and England are very different places. New York City, there was a moment in the aftermath of 9/11 when the United States tried really hard to pretend that it loved New York. But it really didn't last very long. You know? So I think there is that thing about being a citizen of the great metropolis that somewhat separates you from the rest of the country, because your culture and your attitudes and so on are different. And that's really what I was trying to say, you know. And I also think that there's something similar between the great metropolises. That's to say, I think a move from Bombay to New York is a less dramatic move in some ways than a move from the Midwest, from a small Midwest, from Flagstaff, Arizona to New York is a bigger journey in some ways culturally, rather than coming from Bombay. You know, so I think if you're somebody who knows about big cities, you can relatively straightforwardly adapt to the life of another great city. You know, but if you've grown up in a small place, the big city is a bigger challenge. You know, so I think that's I see. Do we have time for me to tell my Catherine of Braganza story?
Yes.
Okay, here's the weird thing about Bombay and New York. When I first moved here, which was in about the year 2000, I read in the newspaper that, strangely, Bombay and New York have the same queen in their history, which is the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza. As we know, the city moved, or the land area moved ownership from the Portuguese to the British in the dowry of Catherine of Braganza when she married Charles II of England. Soon after that, over here, there were these new boroughs laid out across the river, one of which was called the King's Borough and one of which was called the Queen's Borough. And then the King's Borough became Brooklyn and the Queen's Borough became Queens. And it's named after the same queen. And then there was a sad story that there was somebody who worked this out, proposed that there should be a statue of Catherine of Braganza in Queens, since she's the queen after whom Queens is named. And that was commissioned. The sculptor was commissioned to do this. And then a couple of sad things happened. The first is that it became clear, it was well known actually, that Catherine of Braganza was, to put it mildly, not beautiful. And obviously the woman sculptor who was given the task of doing this obviously saw some pictures of Catherine of Braganza and then decided that she was going to not make a portrait, but she was going to make a multicultural tribute, which was actually much more hideous than poor Catholic. Because, it's like an African American mouth and Chinese eyes. It was a kind of an abortion. So that was happening, and the idea was that it would be a very big sculpture, not as big as the Statue of Liberty, but big, and that it would be placed on the water's edge facing the Statue of Liberty, so that these two iconic women would be looking at each other across the harbour. And then some other group in Queens objected, saying that the royal family of Portugal had been involved in the slave trade, and that how could you have a statue put up in Queens to somebody who was a slaver? And of course, there's two problems with that. One is that there's no evidence that she herself had ever been involved in the slave trade, but certainly the royal family had been involved. And the other is that, what about President Jefferson? What about half the leaders of the United States who actually had been slave owners? That objection was not made. Anyway, the poor lady didn't get her statue, is the sad thing. So the queen after whom Queens is named cannot be honoured in Queens. But she is the same queen who brought Bombay into the ownership of the British, and the city followed. So we have that in common.
You want to ask a question? There'll be a book signing after this, so there will be a chance, I think, to chat with the folks. But yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps a slightly provocative question to both of you, and that is, for whom do you write? You mentioned 130 million Indians who read English, but the majority of those who read novels are reading Chetan Bhagat and his ilk, and not books by both of you. And clearly, people who read your works are part of an educated international elite, of whom we're all part of that today. And you're going to tell beautiful stories of the dispossessed, rendered in lucid, wonderful prose, but will the dispossessed read these stories? Do you feel a responsibility or even an ambition to reach the non-elites of the world?
Well, the non-elites are selling my book at the traffic light. So I'm doing my bit by the dispossessed. So I'm very lucky to have my books translated in a number of Indian languages. And the book as an artifact in our age, but I think every writer is asking these questions, who's actually reading us? Is there a future for the book? V.S. Naipaul recently declared, he does this periodically, he says, the novel is dead.
Then he writes another novel.
Then he writes another novel. Well, my response is, if the novel is dead, I'm a necrophiliac. Speak about this gloomily when we're in a cups, how many books really will be sold, but then we continue writing because it's what we do. And we really can't think of questions of marketing and audience and the social class of people who are reading it. I think what we can do is bear witness and tell stories. And I know that when I read books, I get the same sort of thrill that I do when I read Enid Blyton in my childhood. I went from Enid Blyton to Tolstoy, but there were a few stops in between. And it's just the simple, great thrill of hearing a great story. And I grew up listening to my grandparents tell me stories, and now my friends like Salman tell me stories. So it's good enough for me, and I still, as far as I know, have publishers. So I think it's working for me.
Well, I would say quantity is not the only guide. Otherwise we would all be trying to find the next shade of grey. And if you look at the books that have enormous contemporary sales, those are very often quite short-lived. That's to say, there was a thing I read in I guess Publishers Weekly or something, long time ago now, 10, 15 years ago, where they asked publishers in America not for the list of their best-selling titles of the year, but for the list of the best-selling titles in the history of the publishing company. You know? And at that point, immediately, you discovered, so to speak, the cream rose to the top. Those titles were Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Herman Melville, you know, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, etc. So one of the things that, if you're in this game, that you try and do, is to write books that will last, to write books that will endure and that people will go on finding interesting for a long time. You know? And they might not do as well commercially in the moment, you know, but they stick around. And I think that's, you know, I mean, I'm, for example, very proud of the fact that a book like Midnight's Children, which is a very old book now, you know, I mean, it's 34 years old. You know, the fact that young readers who are not even 34 can still find that book to have relevance to them, and so on, that's a matter of great pride, you know, because that means that it's leaped at least one generation. You know, now, if it leaps 2 or 3 more, then it has a chance of sticking around. You know, but I mean, I won't be there to see that, but it's nice to see it at least embarking on that road. You know, so I think the answer, there's a wonderful thing that the great African-American writer Ralph Ellison was once asked this question about who do you write for? And he said, well, the word that was used in those days was Negro, but he said, I write for the Negro community and for everyone else beyond that I can get. And I think that's as good an answer as there is.